Welcome to the Explainer. So today we're doing something a little different. We're taking a completely fresh, highly analytical look at the 400-year-old works of William Shakespeare. Now, rather than just viewing these plays as, stuffy classic literature you had to read in high school, we're actually going to unpack them for what they truly are. And that is brilliant, incredibly precise corporate forensic audits of human psychology and leadership risk.
Right off the bat, think about that famous line from Macbeth, a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. You see, throughout his work, Shakespeare leaned heavily into this idea of the theatrum mundi, basically the theater of the world. He was constantly reminding his audience that human life operates like a highly engineered performance. For him, things like sovereign power, crowns, and high social metrics, they weren't absolute reality. He unmasked them as transient, temporary screens that were just hiding the raw, messy human machinery underneath.
Okay, let's dive into our executive briefing for today. We'll start by looking at market conditions in the commercial boom, then shift to the cultural changes in the invisible drama. After that, we'll run two rapid case studies, Hamlet's cognitive paralysis and Macbeth's blind execution, before wrapping up with the modern blueprint of leadership failures. Section 1. The commercial boom. To really understand the data encoded in Shakespeare's plays, we first have to understand the rapid stabilization of England at the time. The late 16th and early 17th centuries marked a period of massive geopolitical continuity. Think about it. Elizabeth I begins her long-term sovereign stewardship in 1558. By 1588, England completely neutralizes the Spanish Armada, and that political stability continues right through under James I all the way to 1625. This baseline era basically established England as a dominant global superpower. And what that did was provide the perfect runway for a massive, booming new commercial theater industry. Because of that boom, we see a massive market shift in how storytelling was actually delivered. It transitioned away from the old continental model, which was super exclusive, courtly, and tightly controlled, directly into the London commercial model. Shakespeare was operating out of high-volume, mass-market venues like the Globe. His audience was this deeply heterogeneous demographic matrix. I mean, he had everyone from completely illiterate workers standing in the mud right up to high nobility. So to keep this incredibly noisy audience aligned, his scripts had to be dynamic. They systematically and rapidly alternated between deep philosophical inquiries one minute and ruthless, violent corporate betrayals the next. Moving right along to Section 2, the invisible drama. So even as the market was absolutely booming, the underlying culture was experiencing a total disruption. The pristine optimism of the early Renaissance, this golden idea of human perfection, well, it basically started to collapse. It was buckling under the weight of long-term religious wars and some wildly unsettling new astronomical discoveries. Suddenly, there's a sharp rise in deep existential doubt and melancholia. To capture this complex, kind of terrifying new reality, Elizabethan theater completely threw out the academic rulebook. They rejected rigid Aristotelian constraints, like locking a play into one specific time and place. Instead, they opted for a totally fluid, dynamic narrative architecture that smashed high tragedy and raw comedy right together.
Now, what's really interesting here is how Shakespeare completely re-engineered a very basic theatrical tool, the soliloquy. Before this cultural disruption, a soliloquy was basically just a tactical brief. It was a character standing up and simply detailing their next physical move to the audience. But under Shakespeare, it transformed into a fierce internal debrief. The stage literally became a mirror of the internal human apparatus, mapping out real psychological contradictions and acute moral crises in real time.
Section 3, Hamlet and cognitive paralysis. Let's see this internal debrief in action. We can actually frame Hamlet as a forensic investigation that goes catastrophically wrong. The inciting incident is wild. Prince Hamlet returns to his Danish headquarters to find a rapid regime change. His uncle Claudius has just seized the sovereign throne. Then, out of nowhere, a spectral asset manifests on the castle walls. The ghost of Hamlet's father appears to expose a devastating data leak. He was assassinated by his brother via poison delivered right to the ear. And naturally, the ghost demands an immediate retaliatory strike. But let's walk through Hamlet's operational failures step by step, because it is a mess. First, he simulates cognitive instability, madness, so he can run his forensic investigation without triggering defensive corporate countermeasures from his uncle. Brilliant, right? But instead of executing a rapid strike, he gets completely bogged down in step 2. He just runs endless, deep intellectual audits and spirals into existential doubt. In step 3, he actually manages to validate the assassination data by staging a nested theatrical performance to stress test his uncle's guilt. The data is confirmed, but he hesitates, and this hesitation cascades into step 4, causing accidental liquidations. He kills his advisor Polonius and triggers Ophelia's suicide. Finally, his absolute inability to act results in step 5, a toxic network of poisoned blades that causes the total liquidation of the entire royal family asset base. The sovereign throne is left completely empty.
Section 4, Macbeth and blind execution.
If Hamlet is the tragedy of inaction, Macbeth is the exact complementary opposite risk profile. The setup here is incredibly efficient. Macbeth is a loyal, highly decorated Scottish general. One day, he receives a mystical forecasting from 3 witches who predict he will secure the supreme sovereign asset, the kingship of Scotland. And almost instantly, state messengers arrive confirming his promotion to a lesser title. This immediately validates the forecast and ignites a highly combustible spark of predatory ambition. Let's track Macbeth's rapid operational steps. Step 1, he gets that mystical forecasting. Step 2, his cold, calculating operational partner, Lady Macbeth, heavily incentivizes immediate regicide. They violate sacred hospitality laws to assassinate the king while he's literally a guest in their castle. Step 3, Macbeth secures the throne, but his internal apparatus is immediately consumed by severe paranoia. He starts triggering a series of targeted liquidations just to hedge his power. And this cascades rapidly into step 4. Because he acted blindly without ever processing the risk matrix, he suffers a total psychological collapse. We're talking severe guilt loops, imaginary bloodstain metrics, torturing his wife, and ultimately his own termination in combat by Macduff. Just total operational madness.
Section 5, leadership failures and the modern blueprint.
So let's bring these case studies together and see how they apply to the media landscape we consume today. The crucial point is captured perfectly in 6 simple words. To be, or not to be. This isn't just a famous line of poetry to print on a tote bag. It established itself as the absolute baseline logo for the Western identity crisis. Shakespeare's forensic lens anticipated the foundational metrics of modern psychoanalysis. Things like clinical depression, complex guilt loops, and neuroses, literally centuries before any medical professional formalized them. And this brilliantly illustrates the core takeaway of our analysis today, the absolute bipolarity of leadership failures. On one side, we have Hamlet, who represents data without execution. He possesses perfect diagnostic data, but he runs so many macro simulations about the consequences that he absolutely cannot pull the operational trigger. On the flip side, we have Macbeth, who represents execution without data. He pulls the trigger, driven purely by predatory ambition, acting long before processing the risk matrix, and entirely destroys his internal alignment in the process. So, how does all this build our modern entertainment market? Well, the reality is, virtually the entire global market for premium television deploys the exact same structural engines engineered by Shakespeare 400 years ago. Whether you're watching the toxic underbelly of political structures in House of Cards, the ruthless corporate proxy wars in Succession, or the massive family asset battles in Game of Thrones, these stories are universally relying on the treasonous dialogue structures and standardized psychological archetypes first built in the courts of Elsinore in Scotland. Which brings us to a final provocative thought for you to take away from this explainer. The next time you sit down to stream a premium drama, I want you to look closely at the underlying architecture. Which Shakespearean leadership risk profile is driving your favorite modern character? Are they trapped in the cognitive paralysis of Hamlet, overthinking every move? Or are they hurtling toward the blind, catastrophic execution of Macbeth? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and I hope this gives you a powerful, analytical new lens to view both these classic texts and your next weekend binge watch.